Hello lovely patrons, welcome back to another Patreon exclusive video. Today I thought I'd share with you guys how I go about finding true vintage pieces on the internet. I know on my channel I've shared quite a lot of videos on how to know if something is vintage, but I haven't really shared how I actually search for vintage stuff and find it online. So I thought I would share that with you guys. As you know, if you're in the £5 and up tiers, you get the curated vintage finds each Tuesday. So I'm going to use that as an example of how I go about searching particular things when I'm looking for certain items, what kind of search terms I use, and because these days a lot of people are selling vintage but they don't actually know anything about the product they're selling, what are the kind of layman's terms, or what do people often mislabel something when they are selling a vintage piece, so that you can find a bargain, because quite often it's the people that don't realize what they're selling that are selling things for much less than what they're worth. So I thought I would go through how I do that today. So let's get started.
What have you got if you haven't got love?
Like every video at the moment I have a cup of coffee, but I'm filming in this room because there's great light. I can set up all of my lights and everything and I'm not in anyone's way, and the decor is stunning. Val's mum just redid this room. It's Val's brother's old room and it's got a real 60s vibe to it. And yeah, I love filming in here and taking photos, but there's no heater and it is the middle of winter in France and it is freaking freezing up here. So I'm sitting on like a little cozy blanket and I have like all the lights pointed at me, so that's helping me keep slightly warmer. And then I have a hot drink because otherwise I'd be like, hi guys, I'm gonna tell you about what this video is about. What? Anyway, have a sip of coffee, B. So one of the first things I do is do my research. I've been buying vintage and looking at vintage and obsessing over vintage for decades now, but even I am not a fashion historian, so I have to do my research. So I tend to go to Vintage Dancer. This blog is freaking amazing. It is historically really, really good, and it tends to go into way more details than a lot of other historical fashion sites do. So you can just look at a blog post that is exclusively about 1950s winter jackets if you want to, and that whole post will have a ton of information just about that, all of the different styles, all their names, all the variations of their names, which year it was fashionable in, because obviously that's a whole 10 years that fashion all over the world happened. And you know, if we want to get specific, we can talk about the fashion in America in 1957, for example. It's going to be very different from 1951, so, or even 1956. So Vintage Dancer is really, really good for getting that information. She also does link to other places where you can find info, so I do find it just a really, really good base. So for this occasion, I went there looking specifically at 1950s winter coats, and I learned a whole lot that I didn't know as well. Like the princess coat and the swing coat, I had heard of the swing coat before. I thought the princess coat and the swing coat were the same thing, but a swing coat just refers to the pleats in the back that swing when a woman walks, but a princess coat is specifically that kind of nipped in at the waist, going out over a large full skirt and a petticoat shape. So that's that. Would explain why I'm not a huge fan of the princess coat, because I've never been into that kind of petticoat 1950s look. I'm much more into the pencil dress and the capris. So I'm much more into a cape coat, a traditional swing coat, a straight coat, a trench coat. I really like toppers, like the cropped toppers that have kind of almost that triangle shape to them with the really big open sleeves with the cuff turned back. I love all those kinds of styles, but they can be a little tricky to find because the princess coat is so popular. Often when you just search 1950s coat, what dominates your search results is the princess coat. So knowing your terms is really important for searching for very specific things that you want. And often too, because not everyone is familiar with things beyond one style of coat or one style of clothing for an era, sometimes these more specific items are not even labeled as vintage, because people don't realize that, you know, when their family member or someone passed away, that their wardrobe is actually filled with 1950s clothes. As far as they know, that jacket is from 5-10 years ago. But in fact, it's not. It's a 1950s topper or box coat or something that they're not familiar with. So that is a really, really good place to start. Then I usually head to eBay. Etsy these days is really quite expensive. I follow very specific vintage dealers that I often find on Instagram, and then I go and follow them on Etsy that are specifically more in my price range and that don't collect really special vintage pieces. Like, I absolutely love Jade from Scarlet Rage Vintage. I mean, she's one of my closest friends, but she does specialize in very specific pieces, in patterns and amazing colors and rare pieces. So obviously it's going to be pricey because she has to put a lot of work into that, and also the pieces are hard to come by, so you're paying for the rarity. Whereas I tend to buy more everyday wearable vintage that is more affordable. There's more of it around. It's not particularly special, but I'm still getting the cut and the material and the style that I'm looking for. So that's what I tend to aim for with Etsy. With eBay, you never know what you're going to get, which is what I love about it. It's kind of like going thrifting, but on the internet. So what I do on eBay is sometimes I'll just stick a really basic search term in, like 1950s, click the filters and choose vintage clothing and accessories, and then choose women. However, not everybody lists vintage pieces as vintage on eBay. So then what I'll do is, without filtering anything, I'll just use specific search terms. So I might say 1950s princess coat. That usually results in every coat under the sun. And what tends to dominate the feed is reproduction, because Collective and a bunch of other brands, but Collective especially, do a lot of princess coats, and so they really dominate the feed if you do that. So you'll get ones being sold by them on their eBay site, because all those companies also have an eBay as well. But then lots of people who are reselling their products. So once I typed in princess coat, I was like, okay, this is not gonna work. So then I tried 1950s swing coat, 1950s duster coat, 1950s spring coat. Now, you will have noticed in the last lot of vintage finds that I named all the different types of coats, but to give you an idea, this was a very popular coat in the 1950s. It was a lightweight, more springtime coat, and it was, I guess, what's commonly known as a dress coat, a coat to go over a dress. You can see how the cut is wide, so some of them came in around the waist, but generally it was a coat that had no particular waistline. It was more kind of tent-like. And it was often referred to as a clutch coat because it didn't have buttons. Women literally clutched it closed, hence the clutch coat. Or the tuxedo coat, because the lapels came all the way down the front like that. But essentially they often matched the dresses. They were lightweight, they had wide sleeves with a rolled up cuff that was quite big, and they had these really clear turned over necklines. So those can be known as clutch coats, tuxedo coats, dusters, spring coats, dress coats. Like, they have lots of different names, and for me that is the epitome of the 50s coat, but for a lot of people the princess coat is, so it just depends. Just by doing something that simple you get a really different search result. Same with if you put in proper search terms for 1950s coats, like 1950s topper coat, 1950s box coat, 1950s long winter coat, 1950s fur coat, etc. You'll get specific results. Then with each of those, if I'm finding I'm getting too broad a kind of result and they're not, really vintage results, then I will go into the filters and start putting vintage or collector's items, etc. in there. Now, something I really want to clarify here is I'm using the term coat all the time here because I have found that the majority of the time that I search for things online, people tend to blanket use terms. So no matter what kind of outer garment you're looking for, everyone calls it a coat. Now, a coat is a long garment that covers you up in wintertime. A jacket is a short upper body outerwear warming garment. So if you're looking for something that only comes to the waist or to the hips, you're looking for a jacket. So technically, I've referred to a topper coat, but it's actually called a topper jacket, a 1950s topper jacket, a 1950s fur jacket. Then you're gonna get stuff that comes to like waist to hip length, maybe, mid-thigh. But if you're looking for a coat, and this is coming from people who know what they're talking about in terms of the seller knows what they're selling, if you search coat, you're going to get long garments, that's the result that you're going to get. So make sure you really know what your terminology is, and learning little differences in the names of things for fashion is really important. Obviously, I'm specifically talking about coats, but this applies to anything. You know the difference between a pencil dress and a shift dress. Like, what are the nuances that make those two dresses different from each other when, you know, the average person will look at them and think, well, that's basically the same dress. The other thing I start doing is thinking, what would somebody call this if they didn't know anything about vintage, if they were just going to say what type of coat this is? So I'll put things in like large cuffed coat, 60s coat. Like, even though it's the wrong decade, a lot of people have no idea what decade things are from. So I'll put in like 1940s box coat, 1940s short coat, 1960s short coat, 1950s cropped coat. To me, a 1950s cropped coat is like a bolero, but a lot of people put in short toppers or box coats as cropped coats. So I will put that in if I'm looking for that kind of jacket. 1950s short swing coat. People just go and call any coat from the 50s a swing coat. If you type in swing coat, you will get every 50s coat under the sun, because people have no idea what a swing coat is. The majority of them don't have a swing on them, which again is the pleat on the back that allows space and movement because it's designed to go over big petticoated 1950s dresses. So put swing coat in, even if you're not looking for a swing coat, because that will get you a lot of results, and then add an adjective. So swing coat with big cuffs, or 1950s swing coat, big cuffs, or 1950s swing coat, fur, or 1950s swing coat, collarless, or, you know, just think outside the box in terms of what someone who doesn't really know what they're talking about would say. And I tend to find some real gems that way. The other thing is just get rid of 1950s altogether and just say like vintage short coat, vintage fur coat, things like that, because the number of times that I search just normal fur coat and I find a million 1950s or 1960s gorgeous, sometimes real mink, sometimes faux fur, cropped fur jackets is insane, because people don't realize that they're not from the 80s. Also, sometimes they are from the 80s, but the cut is literally exactly like a 1950s one would be, in which case, you know, if you want affordable vintage and no one is going to know the difference, why does it matter if you have an 80s coat? You know what I'm saying? I mean, you do you, but for me, I've had a lot of 1980s faux furs that everyone just thought were beautiful 1950s coats. So, you know, as long as no one sees the lining. Sometimes even the lining, the only thing that gives it away is the label, really, because, you know, the way fur coats are made has kind of been the same for a really long time. They've got a pretty similar shape to them. So sometimes you can find things that are very, very passable as vintage that aren't actually vintage. So yeah. Anyway, guys, that's really it. I mean, I know this wasn't a hugely long video, but I wanted to share that because I get a lot of messages asking me how to find vintage that's affordable, and so I assume that people aren't really familiar with how to go about searching for stuff, because obviously the internet is a pretty vast place. So whittling the information that you receive down, if you just type in 1950s coat, or, you know, 1960s dress, or 1940s shoes, or whatever, anything you can do to whittle down the search results is really good, and this is just how I do it. If you guys want to share how you do it, that would be amazing. I always learn so much from other people, particularly just random comments I get on my YouTube channel of people telling me how they do it. I've learned so much from that. So if you guys want to share, please do, for me and for other people watching this. And other than that, I guess I will see you in the Patreon feed and in the next video. Bye.